deep inside a tin mine near Kigali, Rwanda, a silent and deadly threat lingers. Hidden within Tunnel 12, a colony of 10,000 bats carries the Marburg virus, a highly lethal hemorrhagic fever with no cure or approved treatment. The mine workers who excavate these tunnels every day are unknowingly exposed to a pathogen capable of causing outbreaks with devastating consequences. The latest epidemic, which began in September last year, resulted in 66 infections and 15 deaths, underscoring the dangers of human encroachment into wildlife habitats. The question is no longer whether another outbreak will happen, but when, and whether the next one will be worse. Marburg virus is a close relative of Ebola, with fatality rates ranging from 24% to 88%, depending on the outbreak and the quality of medical care available. Its early symptoms, fever, muscle pain, and headaches, are easily mistaken for common illnesses, allowing it to spread before it is detected. Once the infection progresses, it leads to internal bleeding, organ failure, and often death. The virus is primarily carried by Egyptian fruit bats, which roost in caves and, increasingly, in man-made structures like mines. The risk is particularly high in Africa's mineral-rich regions, where tin, gold, copper, and coltan extraction are pushing workers into direct contact with infected bat populations. The pattern is clear. As mining expands, so do the outbreaks. In the case of the Rwandan outbreak, tracing the origin took weeks. The first identified patient was a 25-year-old woman who succumbed to the disease. However, the true source was her husband, a 27-year-old miner who had unknowingly carried the virus with mild symptoms. He had spent weeks working inside Tunnel 12, the very place where thousands of bats had made their home. This delay in identifying patient zero allowed the virus to spread beyond the mine, infecting healthcare workers and raising fears of a larger crisis. While authorities eventually contained the outbreak, the fact remains that 6 other mines in Rwanda have similar characteristics, meaning they too could become breeding grounds for the next epidemic. The rapid urbanization of mining areas and the aggressive expansion of extractive industries have made human-wildlife interactions more frequent, creating the perfect conditions for zoonotic spillover, when viruses jump from animals to humans. The data is alarming. In the 2000s, 4 Marburg outbreaks were recorded. In the 2010s, there were 3. But in the current decade, there have already been 6, and we are only halfway through. Each outbreak is a warning sign, yet the global response remains inadequate. The international community, which once funded pandemic prevention initiatives, has shifted its focus elsewhere. Rwanda's prevention program itself was reliant on U.S. financial aid, which was frozen under the Trump administration, leaving the country to manage the crisis with limited resources. The government's response to the recent outbreak included closing off Tunnel 12 and erecting barriers to keep workers away from the bats. However, no effort was made to relocate or eliminate the animals, as officials admitted that the bats would likely return or migrate to another tunnel. Instead, authorities are monitoring their movements, collecting biological samples, and considering GPS tracking to study their flight patterns. But despite these measures, the fundamental problem remains. Mining continues, and workers are still exposed to the risk. The reality is that the mine was never going to shut down. The economic incentives driving the extraction of tin, coltan, and other minerals far outweigh the risks posed by Marburg virus. No worker chose to leave their job, even after the outbreak, because the financial necessity of employment in a resource-dependent economy leaves them little choice. Operations have simply shifted to other tunnels on the opposite side of the hill, while a small on-site clinic has been set up to provide emergency care. This approach may mitigate the immediate threat, but it does nothing to address the long-term dangers of virus transmission in mining regions. The crisis unfolding in Rwanda is not an isolated incident. Across Africa's Great Lakes region, similar outbreaks have occurred in Uganda, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Kenya, and Tanzania. The latest Marburg cases in Tanzania's Kagera region have already resulted in 10 deaths, and given the steady increase in outbreaks over the past 2 decades, it is only a matter of time before a larger, more devastating epidemic emerges. The world has seen what happens when hemorrhagic fevers like Ebola or Marburg spread uncontrollably. With fatality rates that can reach nearly 90% and no approved vaccine, the stakes could not be higher. As extractive industries continue their relentless expansion, the likelihood of new zoonotic outbreaks will only increase. The lessons of this outbreak must not be ignored. Nature is warning us, but whether we listen remains uncertain. Without stronger preventive measures, better surveillance, and international cooperation, the next outbreak may be deadlier, more widespread, and far more difficult to contain.